Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Martin from Reedsy, welcoming you once more to a Reedsy Live cover critique. Here at Reedsy, we're lucky enough to work with, I think, probably over 100 fantastic freelance book cover designers who are based all over the world, with a wealth of experience in different genres and different levels of experience. And every now and again, we bring one of them on to Reedsy Live here, take book covers that you have submitted, and then we're going to share it live right here on Facebook Live and talk about it. We'll try not to sugarcoat stuff. We'll tell you where we think it works, where it doesn't work, and where you can improve it. Naturally, we're a place where authors hook up professionally with experienced designers, but we're not going to push you towards that or anything today. All we're trying to do is make sure that you're putting out the best book that you possibly can. Without me gabbing on much more, I'm going to introduce my co-host for today. It's Annemieke. Oh, Annemieke, can you hear me?
Hi, yes I can. Thanks for having me. My name is Annemieke Beemster Leverenz. I'm an independent graphic designer. I'm working out of Seattle, Washington right now. But I've worked for about 10 years independently, and most of that time was spent in New York, working in books and publications, a little bit of illustration, occasionally a website, a little bit of everything. But really my true love is books, from the interiors to the covers. And a lot of that time has been spent in the young adult space, working with Gallison, Mud Puppy, and HarperCollins. So I'm super excited to be here, and there's a lot of cool covers to look at. So I wanted to start with young adult and children's books, just since that's my area of expertise. This one is a young adult book that the cover art really struck me. I think it's really lovely and original. I think there's a few more edits that could take place to really make this cover sing. First and foremost, it's a little tough for me to tell that it's a YA book. There's a lot of good details in here, and one of those details is sort of the image of the child at the bottom, or the teen. So I think it would be really nice to see, maybe zoom in on that tower at the left. It's full of a lot of really unique details, and punch up the aspects of the figure at the bottom that make it look more like a teen. You could change the clothing or the hair, or I think even just getting it to be a little bit bigger would be better. The color palette is really nice, but I would probably brighten it a bit. It's a little hard to read all the small details again. And then I would probably bring up the like figure at the bottom, use a brighter yellow or something like that. The other thing that I think you might want to spend some time on is the typography. Right now it's a little bit less considered than this image. You could do a number of things with it. I think adding some texture or some three-dimensionality, just to really make it feel like it's as considered and thought through as the image. Another thing that I always like to add is a tagline. And I think that almost all covers can benefit from some overview of what you're looking at here, or some sort of intriguing single sentence. So I would definitely add that. There's certainly a space, and just make it, nice and sort of author. People may be coming to your book with zero background on you, or the work that you're doing. So as much as you can give with that cover image, I think it's really super important. So yeah, overall, I think this is a really beautiful cover image. The composition is really nice. I would just zoom in and make sure that that figure really looks like a young adult character, just to make sure that it sits well within that genre, and just finesse that type a bit more. The next cover is also a young adult book that I think isn't totally reading as a young adult book. The things that I do like about the composition overall, I like that you've separated it into 3 different areas here. It makes the type very legible. And I like what's happening with the texture behind the type of the title. It's pretty cool. I don't know if everyone can see, there's sort of like a hieroglyphics in the background, so it gives it that sort of historical, ancient feel, which is pretty fun. The main thing here I think that I would pay attention to is that the photos themselves are pretty dark, and it's a little bit hard to see what is going on in them, just because they The bottom one I think is a pyramid upside down, which is a cool concept. I would just make it a little bit brighter. And the top is pretty hard to see what's going on. I had to really zoom in. So when people are viewing your book cover online, I think it'll be very challenging to understand what's going on at a glance. So I might change the photo to something else. Again, it's pretty hard to tell that it's a young adult book. Could be an adult mystery or historical fiction. Definitely has sort of a scary vibe, so that's good. But I would zoom in and see if you could get maybe an outline of a character or shadow or a face or something. That way you could probably convey better the intended age of the audience. Right now it's a tough one to read, and it's a pretty specific scene that doesn't necessarily immediately register. The second thing I would recommend here is to spend a bit more time on the type. I think that the font you're using for, I believe, the entire thing is working pretty well for the author and the Era of Shadows series, the series name at the top. It doesn't feel as complete or finished right there as the title. I feel like because of this like super spooky title, you could go pretty fun with this and have a typeface with a lot more character. It is legible as is, which is great, but it would be nice to see, you know, Devoured Souls is really intense. So I would like to see the typeface reflect that. And I think it would add a lot of character to this cover. But I love what's happening with the texture. I like the 3-part composition. It's easy to read at a small size. And the font that you've selected for the subtext, the title, or I mean the author and the series name, those are both, they're nice. They're working really well. So I would just take a second look at the photo at the top, brighten up the whole photography portion of the cover, and maybe take a second look at what you're doing with the typography for the title. So that's good on that one. Do you want to switch it up, Martin? Switching gears a little, still within the YA. This one is, I think, much more clearly a YA book. I like a lot of what's going on here. I think it's very clearly for a feminine audience. The typography is kind of sweet and whimsical, hand-drawn, I think, or a hand-drawn type font. And I think there's a rainbow in the background, which hints that this is an LGBT romance. So all of that stuff is really good and gives a lot of nice cues in a simple and well-organized way to the reader of what they're about to see or read. They're already seeing it. But I do have a few suggestions. I think I love hand-drawn type, and I think it adds a lot of personality, and it's sort of its own image, which is great. I would maybe take away a few of the curly cues just to add to legibility. And maybe thicken up the strokes a little bit just so that it's really legible at a small size. Also, you can see when you zoom out or step away from the book cover a bit that some of the letters at the top on the lighter colors are much easier to read. And by the time you get down to break, it's a little more difficult. So I would try to increase the contrast by maybe lightening some of those colors at the bottom of the heart. Another sort of question I had about the image was the brick wall behind it. I think to me it reads almost like a stand-up comedy or something, and I didn't see that in your synopsis. So if this is about a stand-up comic, then this might be perfect. But my guess is it's probably supposed to be spray painted on an outdoor wall, in which case I think you need a little bit more of a hint to the context. Maybe some tufts of grass or just a different picture altogether. I'm also noticing a little bit of repeats in the bricks at the top. Looks like it maybe was expanded on Photoshop. So you might just want to take another little pass at that. This is another book that I think would benefit from a tagline as well, just to give someone who's interested in the cover a little bit more information about what to expect. There's certainly room for that. Finally, I think, I'm not sure exactly what you'd want to do with this. I think the title or the author name could be just adjusted a bit. It seems like maybe it was just typed in, and everything else seems so well considered that I would argue that maybe you could try another typeface. I'm not in general wild about italics unless you have a really good reason. Maybe try a sans serif, a similar sans serif, but just an upright version of that. I'm getting a comment, which is kind of fun, as to whether this is graffiti. I think it probably is. I'm kind of liking the like allusion to graffiti without it being like super drippy and aggressive. The synopsis didn't really seem like that was, it's not about a graffiti artist as far as I can tell. So maybe I think that's a good comment. We could up the graffiti like quotient a bit by maybe a few oversprays on the outside of the heart or something like that. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, just to give it a bit more real life feel. This is another one where I really like the image. I think it's really pretty, and although it's a simple cover, I think it's easy to read. All the elements, and I think there's a nice balance between the handwriting and the author name. I think it could get a little bit more attention to detail, or maybe just some like extra texture, a tagline, something else to give it a little more depth. But when I looked at this cover, I definitely see young adult. It's clearly a young woman, and other than that, I'm not really getting a lot of details about her. I would get a contemporary book, but the synopsis actually shows that this may be a medieval book. So I think here this cover is really nice, but I'm not sure it's conveying enough about the book to really sell it. I would consider maybe, I'm thinking about how to add a medieval and a simple as line that you could Photoshop in or thing, but I think it might just be that you want to look for a similar picture that has sort of more period specific clothing or accessories or something like that. And even though I like the typography, I'm also now thinking that maybe it should be somehow a little bit more medieval, maybe a version of sort of a black letter. It would be awesome if you could make sort of a handwritten black letter. That is a high level task, but it could be super awesome. And I think the title name or the author name is also something that you could experiment with the typeface and make it a bit more era specific so that it looks a bit more historical. I just got a comment from Paul King. He suggested a spot UV on the word red, which would be super awesome. I'm not sure if that is within the realm of most self-published books, but if you could have a bit of spot UV, which is just sort of like just the lettering, that would indeed be super lovely. So, you know, I guess if you do have the means to sort of have that custom treatment, that's always a way to add something. Not sure that's really something that everybody or can access, I guess. So overall in this one, I think nice cover, but I think it's not really screaming medieval quite enough. So if there's a way to switch the image or the type to kind of lead the reader in that direction, that would be the best. The next book is also young adult. I was really struck by this cover because the craft of it is really well done. I would assume, because this is I assume that somebody made this, that the author or designer made this and photographed it, and the quality of the photograph and the craft itself is really great. And I think this really stands out because a lot of people don't go to this effort. It really strayed from this sort of like photo type combo. So that's really special and awesome. I think a few additional things would really make this go the extra distance. For one, I'm still not totally sure that this is YA. I was thinking potentially you could add some little doodles on the paper bag or something pretty minimal, just to kind of give it that kid vibe. Teenagers are always doodling, so you could have it be like little plot points or their names, or just something to give it kind of a youthful vibe. Because you have so much extra space on the bag portion of this, I think you could also enlarge the type. That would make it more legible at a small size, especially if you're you know, for a thumbnail on Amazon or so forth. It's also, the synopsis mentioned that it was a funny book, and the tagline, I don't know if everyone online can see it, but it says, "This is the best book I've ever read, and you can take my word for that. I'm your librarian." Signed, your librarian. I feel like that is kind of cheeky and funny. So maybe up the size of that, since it kind of hints that this is a tongue-in-cheek book. I think the author name looks great. So overall, I think it's a really strong first pass. I would just take up some of that space with the typography that you've already made. If it's possible to Photoshop, you could just have paper bag mask. I would make the quote a bit bigger, maybe add some doodles or something to give it a bit more of a youthful vibe, and I think you're pretty close. Let's see, the next book. So this one is pretty far along. I think it looks really awesome. It's got solid typography. I think the composition is really nice. It feels just so complete. Like you couldn't take any piece out of this because everything is so well locked together, and there's a lot of dimension. We're getting a lot of narrative elements. It feels really nice. My concern with this is that it was presented as a young adult book, and I think it's really reading as more of a middle grade, so like 8 to 12-year-olds, although I think kind of on the younger side of that. So if you do intend this to have a young adult audience, which is really sort of 8th grade and above, I think you'd need to switch some things to age it up a bit. And that would be kind of a comprehensive change. I think that the hand-drawn type is super awesome, but has sort of a more whimsical vibe. The characters themselves look younger. And then even just sort of I don't think it's impossible to have a witchy young adult book, but this really sort of has the friendly witch of a younger audience. So I would probably, I guess I question if that really was a young adult book, but if it is, I think it needs to be aged up a bit. Otherwise, as a standalone, it's a beautiful cover. I think a lot of it is really working super well. See here. The next one is also a children's book. This one I think is compositionally very strong, but the contrast and sort of hierarchy of the elements is making it hard for me to kind of, I think, read it the way that it should be read. For me, the very first thing that I see here is the ghost. And the ghost doesn't really read as sort of children's or anything. So right off the bat, I'm a little bit confused. I think what I would recommend here is to sort of start by scaling back and sort of flattening the image like color-wise, so there isn't quite so much contrast, so that you can really have the elements that you need to pop. So I believe that would be the elf and the title. I think the ghost should probably be sort of like more ghostly and like maybe a little bit more transparent. So that's sort of like, oh wow, you're realizing that that is like a scary apparition to this little guy. I would also probably just finesse the shape of the elf. I had a really hard time figuring out exactly what was going on there. I think the hat is to the left, but I originally was thinking that might be sort of a long nose. So I would just sort of clean up that shape just a little bit. And if he's throughout the book, I'm sure you can pick another outline. This might work great when you have a bit of fill and context to what you're looking at. But as an outline, I think it's a little challenging to decipher. I think the typefaces that you've picked are great. You could give them a little bit more movement and personalization by kind of varying the size and shape. With a kid's book, you can get really whimsical. Might have Evan be larger, for example. Maybe the characters could bounce around a little bit. I just feel like overall I want like a little bit more dimension and a little bit more hierarchy, so that the elements that you want to pop are really the brightest, lightest elements. I hope that helps with that one. So now those were the ones that were sent in for the young adult and children's. So the rest of these are going to go through sort of some other genres. I just picked a handful of each. And first off is sort of the fantasy, historical kind of conglomerate of genres. This first one is a historical piece. The things that I like about this are we have a pretty sassy cover model who's clearly exhibiting the fact that she is not in the present time. I'm definitely like sort of the images that you've picked. The second thing that strikes me is this cover is extremely brown, which I think is not serving you super well. I would probably pop up just a little bit of the color in the image. My guess is that it has an overlay to give it sort of an old-timey sepia vibe, but I maybe just would scale that back a little bit. I think the typeface that has been selected for the title is good. I would probably up the contrast a bit so it's more legible and in the first thing that you see. And ideally, I think I would give it some texture, a little bit of a 3D effect, maybe some aging to really hit the point home that this is historical. The supporting typefaces, I think, need some work. I would like something with a bit more of a historical vibe. These are both Helvetica or Arial or something, and I think it's just a bit too default for something that is supposed to be era specific. Also, there were a few covers where people used italics when I didn't totally understand if there was a particular reason for that, and I would caution against using italics unless there's a specific reason why you're doing so. They just tend to be a little bit more difficult to read, and there's not generally a use for that. So overall, I think you're in the right direction here. You've clearly got like an old-timey vibe, medieval vibe. I would just pay a little bit more attention to the and then if you get a little tiny bit more information, the cover model is a little quick. I think I would spend a bit more time on the photoshopping there. You could probably make her even a little bit bigger because she's really sort of the power part of this cover. Move around a little bit. That would be my suggestion for that one. Move on to the next fantasy. This cover has a really great image. This is just really nice composition, very skillfully rendered, super fun, definitely conveys the genre. So I wouldn't really change anything there. I do think the cover could be stronger if it had a little bit more attention paid to the typography. It's a little tough to read. I can see that there's been a black border put around the type to get it to read on this lighter background where it's placed. But I would try to figure out a way to make it even more legible. If you zoom out to thumbnail size, it's pretty difficult to see that type. So I would change the color or lighten the background and darken the type or somehow figure out a way to make it a bit more legible and powerful on that background. I'd also give a little bit, the picture itself is just, has so much depth. There's so much like dramatic lighting. And then the type isn't by any means bad. I think it's a nice typeface and there's some distressing, but I just want it to sing as much as this image does. So I would give it some attention to, again, sort of the dimensionality, the texture of it. I think, you might want to not just have it be typed out all in one size, but maybe iron is smaller or larger, depending on what is more important. You could have some decorative elements sort of very lightly behind it in a texture or something just to give it the oomph. I'm also wondering if you could Photoshop maybe the bow of the bow and arrow or her head in front of the type so it really feels like it's sitting in that image. I think that would be really strong. The author type, I think, is pretty close. You might space it out a bit more. It just feels like it's kind of sneaking away to the side because it's trying to make room for this beautiful image. So give the type its proper space on the page, and it has to be there too. But otherwise, it looks awesome. So that's good on that one. Let's see. Here's another fantasy book. This one included a back cover, so I assume it will be printed IRL. I think the overall vibe of this is getting to be the right place. There's a lot of good narrative elements in here that somebody would be able to pick up on. Got the music, since it's about a musician. There's definitely a spooky vibe. That's clear. But one thing that really shocked me when I looked closer to this is on the back cover, there's this menacing monster that is super awesome. And I just want it to be on the front cover. don't know if it's a little hard to read or see because it's a very low contrast, but there's a monster kind of creeping in. It has red eyes, and I just want that to be on the cover to kind of increase the suspense and menacing quality of this cover. So the first suggestion I would say is get that over to the front. Second of all, I think, again, the typography is in the right direction. It's a nice typeface, but I think it needs a little bit more attention. And I would also, maybe there are a lot of details here, but as I was reading the synopsis, it said it's about New York City, and I'm not getting that vibe at all. So I might try to include an element of the New York skyline or something that hints to the fact that we're in a city here. And potentially I would adjust some of the details. The rose petals look almost sort of the blue rose petals, right? Yeah. I think they're almost like romantically like scattered around, and this is definitely more of a like scary scenario. So I might make them seem like they really like flew out of the scene after somebody had to leave. So just some subtle, details. I would definitely work on the type. If you can bring that monster forward. Most people, if the book is lying on a shelf or on a table, or if it's online, they're only going to be seeing that front cover. So don't keep anything precious on the back, because it's really going to be a very small proportion of people that end up looking at that. So just make sure that everything important is real easy to see from the beginning.
Hey, me again. I was wondering, what do you think of the spacing of the type on the back cover there? It looks like it's all like it expands a bit the further it goes down. Yeah,
I think the back cover type could definitely use some finessing. It's a good start. I think you could probably add. It does look a bit. It's not quite taking up enough space on the back cover there. It feels like there's a lot of space, and you can have the same amount of type without it feeling like it's got a lot of room to swim around. So I would probably center the whole body of text. And then for the description itself, you've justified the text. So it's keeping a very solid right and left margin. And the program that you're using will automatically stretch the words, really stretch the spaces to fill that space. It is a very common technique to justify the text like that. It isn't working super well here. You can see some lines, the spaces between the words are very small and other ones very large, and it looks a little bit clunky. There's multiple ways around this. You can either just choose not to justify it, which I prefer in general type where one of the sides is ragged. So it's sort of, in and out depending on the length of the line. You could center it. That is another option that is totally acceptable on a back cover. Or you can rewrite or choose the line breaks so that these spaces are sort of better distributed. But I think Martin is right to call it out. It just it's a little difficult to read right now, and it looks a little bit spaced in a sort of uncomfortable way. And this, I believe, is the last of the fantasy, historical vibe ones. One thing that I really liked about this one is the elements here are really strong, I think. Especially, I really like that the typography has been sort of set into, I think, what is maybe like a obelisk or a gravestone or something. I think that's a really nice technique to make it feel like it is really set there and solid. And it does a lot to sort of create that mood of something spooky. That said, I think it needs just a little finessing. Still, I can see sort of like the outlines that make me think it's from a Photoshop filter, which, everything starts in Photoshop, or many things start in Photoshop, but you want to give it a little extra attention to make it look as real as possible. So I would just pay a little bit more attention to, not the typeface or anything, I think that's great, just the details of that effect. I would also probably enlarge the medallion at the middle with that cat figure. It is, Michael Ross helpfully said, make that panther easier to see. I totally agree. I think there's no reason not to take up as much space as possible with that cool panther. The lighting effect is pretty subtle, so you could brighten it and make it bigger, just so that is really evident. I think this is a nice typeface for the author name. Again, I've said this a few times now, but I would add a tagline if you can find the space for it. Can't hurt. But otherwise, I think this is a really good start. I think if you just kind of enlarge those elements, give them a little bit of finessing in Photoshop, I think you'll end up with something that is really like nicely conveys the genre, is strong, legible, has a good mood to it. From here now, there's a, these are all sort of, I think, they're varied in theme. This cover, I think, is pretty fun and bold, and I'm always into sort of a hand-drawn illustration element. However, I think I would scale it back a bit. There's a lot happening here. I'm getting sort of various elements are calling out sort of a cyber vibe. There's other ones that are, to me, very Russian in their like red and white and bold elements. So I would probably try to strip back the Russian elements. I didn't see that in your synopsis. Primarily that burst behind the clenched fist. It is very bold and making it hard to read the type. So maybe replace that with sort of a digital texture, or really minimize the contrast on that. Really what we want to see is that hand, some light digital elements, and you've got to be able to read the type. There's a few other sort of details that I think you could just sort of strip away and make it more bold and simple, since it already seems to be going in sort of like a bold direction. There's a lot of texture behind the hand. I think a lot of that could go. These sort of digital textures around the side, I maybe would just replace them with an all over sort of digital texture in the back that, again, has much lower contrast. Different, and I like that bold fist right in the middle. I think overall the composition is pretty nice. And the typefaces are well chosen as well. The next one is also super bold. I'm very drawn to this. I love a bold illustration. I think it is pretty close. I really like the typeface. I like this pig drawing. I like the colors. I'm getting sort of a mystery vibe. Or I guess, it's called a dark comedy in the synopsis. A few suggestions I would have is you might want to introduce another typeface for the subtitle or your author name. To me, this reads like the subtitle reads as part of the title, or I guess the tagline reads as part of the title. So I see the butcher that wasn't pork. You just want to probably place that somewhere else or put it in a different typeface, because I think what you mean is that wasn't pork. So you just want to make sure that reads correctly. Also, there's a little bit of dead space, a lot of red. So I might sort of adjust the elements. You could make the pig larger or have sort of a looming shadow or something to kind of make the whole cover feel a bit dramatic or more dynamic. KG Petron suggests that the T in the butcher looks like an axe, which is a very interesting point. I think that could be a fun thing to play up if an axe is involved. I was kind of not super into that T just because it's, I don't know, I just wanted to like kind of adjust it a little bit. So maybe the answer to that is to add an axe element. I think the comedic part of this book isn't totally clear to me yet, except for the tagline. I think that has a bit of comedy to it. So if there is a way to sort of introduce something unexpected or sort of lightly silly, but in a dark way, I think that could help convey that this is for somebody who likes dark comedy. But a lot of great things happening here. I think it is pretty fun. The next cover is also illustrated. Initially, when I saw this cover, I was like, oh, this is fun. I like what's going on here. It's bold, it's bright. I think the typography in the title is really nicely like treated and hangs together nicely. But I'm having trouble kind of understanding what is going on in this book. Once I read the synopsis, I think there needs to be some additional elements to get the genre across. I think this is sort of like a loony mystery whodunit. I'm not getting any kind of mystery or murder element here at all. To me, it's very fun and breezy. I think I need just, and I'm guessing that these are all elements of the main character, the uncle, but that's not super clear to a first-time viewer. So I would probably try to add like a figure, a murder weapon, something that is a little bit more plot driven so that you can kind of see that this is a murder. Or yeah, mystery. I guess I'm not totally sure that it's a murder. The typeface is at the bottom. I think I would also probably just pick one and use it for both of those since they're so close to each other, or consider a different placement for a Silicon Valley mystery. You could sit on top of the car door, something like that. But yeah, overall, I just felt like it needed a little bit more narrative oomph to get it to the mystery place. So that would be my main suggestion for this guy. The next cover was also described as a comedy. And I totally get that the comedy vibe is really hard to convey in a cover. I think it's often sort of like big type, and I think the last cover did that pretty well, sort of like kooky type. It can also be done in sort of an unexpected element, sort of anything that might be just some sort of combination of visuals that are surprising, sort of get that comedy across. This cover has a really beautiful original illustration, but I am not sure that it's conveying at this point any sort of comedic element. In fact, he looks maybe a little bit wistful. So I would see if there's a way to either incorporate this image into a larger scene or adjust his face a bit so that you get the sense that he's a Joker. And then on top of that, I think the typography really looks pretty serious, sort of classical even. So I think it needs to reflect the comedic narrative of this. Just try something a little bit punchier. This is a situation where you might want to go to the bookstore and just see a bunch of books that are sort of in the same vibe and use them as inspiration to see, like, okay, probably very few are using cursive or a script font. You're going to probably see a lot more bold type, brighter colors, sort of happy, punchier things. The write-up of this just didn't seem to match exactly what I'm seeing. So maybe possible to incorporate this painting with the addition of different elements and different typography, but I think this still has a little ways to go before it is really speaking to what the content is. Let's see. The next one, now we're moving into sort of the women's romance, erotic genre. This first one is described as a contemporary Western romance. And I really like what's happening here conceptually. I think we're headed in a good spot. The type really screams women's chick lit. Kind of not wild about the phrase chick lit, but I know that's the term. I think we see here that there's sort of a reluctant dad. He kind of doesn't know what to do with the bottle or the bear. And then I like how we are sort of set in a place which is the Texas Hill Country down at the bottom with a very subtle cityscape, which I think is really working nicely. Two things I think would really help this cover, possibly trying to find, and this may be really difficult, a photo where the man is a bit like hotter. I feel like he's not super romantic right now. He's just a dad. So I know that it seems like the play between dad and romantic target is kind of important. So I might have him holding, again, this is maybe hard to find, but if he's holding a bear in one hand and a rose in another, or, you know, maybe like a slightly more like fitted outfit or something that, you know, would say, okay, he's also a romantic interest. I think that might help sort of convey the romance part of this book. I also like the script that you're using, or I guess I like the fact that you're using script. I think that speaks to the genre. I might just test out a few other ones. This one is kind of interlocking weirdly with the G in shotgun and the W in wedding. And it's just it's very condensed. It might be nice to see a different typeface. It might just work a little bit better and read a little bit clearer. Lastly, and this is, I didn't see a lot of this happening, but I know it can be hard not to sort of fill up that space for the author name completely, but I would reduce the impact of the author's name here a bit. You could either make it smaller or space it out, or make it a little bit of a finer typeface. I don't think it needs to be quite so bold on the page. For self-published authors, it's often, you know, you're not being, your reputation is still being built. So I think you want to first and foremost have the title of the book be the most bold. Sinya Kops also suggests that the red font above the author's name is hard to read. 100% agree with that. Can barely see that. So I would, it says award-winning author. Generally that can, there's a good example of where you might use italics to show that it is subtext, but maybe a nice serif font you could use in italics above Barbara's name, just to signify her status there. So overall, I think it's good. Just the difficult challenge of finding a man who's holding a baby bottle and a rose, but good luck. So this is another romance book that there's no question in my mind. This is a romance. We've got the sexy couple right front and center. But the ways in which the previous cover, I think, was really strong. It had a lot of like narrative components. You had the bottle and the bear and the scenery from Texas Hill Country. This one feels a little generic to me. So I'd like to actually, I would suggest bringing in some elements that, you know, show a bit more of what's going, or where this is happening. So there's a lot of ways to do that. It could be a prop or a background scenery or something like that. Even just a little bit of color or some sort of pizzazz. I just feel like it's still a little bit flat. I also would take a second look at the typography. It's a nice typeface, I think. The title typeface is nice. All the other ones are sort of similar, but I think that they are all different. So I would narrow it down to, and I would give that title a bit more love. I sort of sexy swashes coming off the R, or some element behind it that gives it a bit of texture. You really want it to feel sort of, I think, sensual, and it still feels a little bit stock out of the box. So I would recommend giving it a bit more attention. And then also for those other, the Epiphany novel, the tagline, and the author name, I would stick to just one or two fonts altogether. The following one, Gayla Yates Gordon says the colors are not as hot as the couple, which, yes, the couple is very hot. Here's another smoking one cover here that is very clearly romance. We have got a extremely muscular man, so I don't think there's any question what this book is about. I think it's pretty overall, the layout of this and the concept are right on target for the genre. I think the color palette is really nice. And I also like sort of the subtle Viking typeface that you've used at the bottom. And that band of texture. I think all of that is working really nicely, especially if those are used throughout other books in this series. I would probably, again, there's a lot of typefaces being used here, and they're pretty similar. So I would try to reduce them. I think the word time could be in the same typeface as the author name. And Fortress, I like that it's a really big swashy script, but right now it's being tracked out. So the letters are spaced far from each other, and the little connector pieces are not connecting to the next letter. So that's making it a little tough to read. So I would either squish those letters back so that they're as they originally intended, or pick another typeface that uses up that space the way that you want it to. So I would, reduce the typefaces and then maybe take another look at Fortress, see if there's another script that might work well for you. But I think you're getting the point across here, so that's great. Let's see here. The next and final romance erotic book is Stirred. This one, I'm really into the photo and the crop. I like that you're really up in their faces. So I love the photo. I would keep that, and the palette and the typeface for the cover or the title, I think, are all working really well. There's just a lot of texture happening here, so I would probably take out some of the texture. It looks like it's sort of obscuring the man's face too, which, unless he is actually, I don't know, it's kind of creepy in a way that I'm not totally sure was intended. You could definitely keep some of this texture, and I think it gives it a mood that is strong, but I would just remove maybe a few layers of that. Especially in the title, I don't think it has quite enough contrast yet, so I would brighten it a bit and make sure that that is really legible at all sizes. But this cover really works at like thumbnail size and above. You're getting a lot of information out of that nice tight crop on their faces. So no question, it's in the erotic zone with a bit of, scariness thrown in. So I think it's reading really well. I would just take away some of those layers of texture. And then finally, For the tagline, I would consider another font. It's sort of a typewriter font that you're using, and that has connotations that, unless somebody is actually like a newspaper writer or writes on a typewriter in here, I think it has a lot of character it has a lot of specific character that you might not be wanting to intend. So I would pick something a little bit more neutral, perhaps a serif or something to give it a bit more texture, since you're using the same typeface for the author and title. So that's it for the romance. We do have, I guess, this is the only one that struck me as sort of a literary fiction submission in the mix that I saw. And I think it's a really cool start to a cover. I definitely want to know more about what this is, what is going on here. It's sort of an unconventional layout and composition. And I think all of the elements do sort of have like an Old West vibe without being too traditional. So that's fun. I like that. I think that the typeface is really nice. I would probably reconsider the type and the one that you're using for of. They're very swashy and feminine. I'm not sure you need to have a different typeface for those. They're just sort of distracting, I think, to me, and not very important words as far as the title goes. I would also probably tweak that Z. It's got a lot of character, and I think it could just be sort of regularized. And let's see, I guess the other concern I had was that this book is listed as a Western, and I do think it's reading more as literary fiction. So if you were concerned about it being a literary fiction book, then you might need to take a step back and kind of think, you know, on a larger scale, like what kind of changes you might want to make to make it more of a Western. I think you could have a figure in that photo that's inside the bird outline, or the bird could become a flat black, or maybe not black with the black type, but another flat color, and you could have a subtle background with a sort of a more traditional, like, man drawing a gun or something like that. That's just a first thought. I'm sure there's a lot more creative potential answers for that problem. But if you're okay with it being read as a literary fiction book, I think this is a really fun, unique looking book cover.
Cool. That's 20. I think we may have time for 2 more. I noticed one of the authors is in here who's done one of the other ones. So if you don't mind, maybe we could just skip to his and maybe do a non-fiction one to round things off.
That sounds great.
Cool.
Surprise me.
Michael Gallagher, I think. So we're going to hit 20. We're going to get 22. Set a new record here.
Great. Oh, this book has a great cover. I really enjoyed looking at this. I can immediately see that it is, as mentioned there, it is high octane. I can get a very action vibe here. So I think there's a lot of really good things that are happening here. The type is like, I love the composition. I like all the elements that you're getting. It has a really strong mood, and I think its genre is very easy to read. I think for this one, I would try to minimize the contrast on that type at the bottom. For me, that's kind of the highest contrast element, and so my eye goes there. But I really feel like that should be kind of like the third thing I read. There's a lot of ways to do this. You could just darken the ground below that so that it is lower contrast, or make that element a little bit smaller, or use a wider typeface so that you can make the entire typeface smaller. So there's a ton of ways you could do that. It's not super challenging to do. You just want to make sure that the title is really the first and foremost thing. To that end, I might move the helicopter a bit. It is nicely placed right there, but it's kind of getting in the way a little bit. So you could just move it to the left or up or something like that. Just a lot of like little fine-tuning things here I think will really like seal the deal on making this a really super strong cover. There's another sort of typeface thing here. I think you're using maybe 3 or 4 condensed typefaces, maybe 2 condensed typefaces and then 2 typefaces in the title. If you can, just sort of use 2 or 3 overall. I think there's no need to really be diverse in the typefaces when they're so similar. And then overall, just everything has a pretty like, everything's nicely packed into a block there, which I think is fine. But the borders are just a little bit off. So I would just take care to make sure that they are, if you want them to be the same, make sure they're really squared up. And if not, then I would make them more different so it doesn't look like an error. What was the other thing? Oh, I did say in your synopsis that it was, or I guess, and it also says right here on the front that it's a thriller. I'm getting more of an action vibe, so I don't know if that difference is, if you wanted it to be more thriller, I think you need a little bit more of, I don't know, you could shift the color tone towards like a bit more red or something like that, or add something on the ground that implies sort of like a thrilling aspect. But I guess I read this more as a little bit more on the action side. But again, you say right there that it's a thriller, so you may be good to go with that. So this is, well, so I was going to lead up to this cover by saying that a lot of the nonfiction use images where I don't really necessarily think it's necessary, or I don't necessarily think it's necessary. But this one, I think, is an example of where a lot of these elements are being used to direct you exactly what the genre that it is, which is a pretty specific sort of how-to in a psychic zone. I think this is pretty fun. So you have a lot of textures, a lot of different elements, and somehow in a good direction. They seem very unified towards their single goal. The cool thing here is the title is extremely legible. My only suggestion would be potentially to explore a different script typeface for psychic. I think it's getting in the way of yellow a bit, and just at a distance I was having a little bit of a challenging time reading it, and that's always a little bit of a concern with the scripts, but it might be worth just trying out some other options. I think the balance between the title, the subtitle, and the author name is pretty good. You could potentially make the subtitle a bit smaller, I think, and it is really nice to have the subtitle on these self-help books. A few of them didn't include that, and I wouldn't even call it self-help, but nonfiction. I think it's really helpful to have that there so that people get a sense of what they're getting at. And then the fact that the yellow brick road is leading right to the author, I assume, is it made me smile. But then when I was reading the synopsis, it said that she has her trademark humor woven throughout the book. And I think this really strikes a really nice balance between really speaking to what the book is about and also kind of embodying how the book is written. So in a lot of ways, I thought this was a really successful cover, even though it is maybe untraditional.
Thank you very much, Annemieke, for doing this with us. I think, judging by the comments we've had, I think we've learned quite a lot today. Really useful stuff. Here at Reedsy, you can always find lots of fantastic designers, such as Annemieke, who can work on a cover with you. Even if you've got a design that you're not quite sure with, they can always help you sort of conceptualize a new one or tweak things to just sort of bring your ideas to life.
No, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun, and yeah, it was a great experience. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. Thank you guys for joining us. Bye.